But in that scenario, when law is something that's local, again, just like with taxation, the agents of law are local and they're elected. So that gets us back to the concept of the sheriff, who still today is the only elected law enforcement official, and that's at the county level. That's more of that legacy from old America, the way it used to be. Do you remember the old Robin Hood scenario, the old story of Robin Hood? You remember who his great enemy was? The Sheriff of Nottingham. Because in the old British system on the island, the sheriff was an agent of the king who came out to collect taxes and take them back to the king. In the United States, he did sometimes perform that function as a tax collector, but instead of being an agent appointed by the state to go out and plunder the county, so to speak, he was an elected official of the county, and he was thus their representative. And so in the midst of the Tea Party and all the things that are going on now, one of the movements that's come out of it is the sheriff's movement. You know, Sheriff Mack is kind of the most famous one, but there are many others who are actually getting very active and are having conferences and speaking about this. And Sheriff Mack actually calls the sheriff America's last great hope. I might not go that far. My dad, by the way, was a sheriff in Indiana for 8 years. Now he's a deputy. But I'm not slighting the sheriff's office by saying that. But he is the only elected official at the local level who has also taken an oath to uphold the Constitution. So he becomes an important figure in recapturing local sovereignty, so to speak. But the important point is that he is a representative of the local people and is there to provide a buffer against intrusion from state and federal governments. So that is the way America used to be. As radical as it may sound, it worked. And that was when America was free. The question is, how was that freedom lost? Well, let me say a little anecdote that my father-in-law tells me. When he was in school, he studied under a conservative sociologist, which is almost an oxymoron, but the scholar's name was Robert Nisbet, and he was a very, very good writer, very insightful, and very conservative. And Dr. Nisbet said that in the year that he was born, 1913, the average individual's only contact with the federal government was the post office. You never saw a federal official for any other reason. But in that same year, we got the federal income tax, and we also got the Federal Reserve. And after that, the Federal Reserve dominated the American money supply gradually over time. It wasn't until 71 that it was completely in dominance. Excuse me. And, of course, the income tax was that, what I was talking about earlier, when the central government claimed the right to skip over the other levels of government and go directly to the individual and take their money. And have you ever seen it? You can go find it. Actually, it's on the IRS's website. If you can go look at the original 1913 tax return form. It was one form for everybody. It was 4 pages, and I think either 2 or 3 of those pages was instructions. And the actual part where you put your income and figured out your tax rate was 1 page. And you said, I make this much, and I think the cutoff was $6,000 a year or something like that. If you didn't make $6,000 a year, you didn't pay income tax at all. $6,000 a year in 1913 money is equivalent to about $120,000 today. So if you weren't upper class, you weren't paying any income tax. If you did make that much money, you paid 1% income tax. And then gradually over time, it stepped up and stepped up and stepped up and stepped up until we got what we have today. But we've actually stepped it back quite a bit since the 50s, 60s, 70s.
Can you clear up a question? Yesterday, when we all had to talk, one fellow was saying when Eisenhower was in office,
Yeah.
income tax was 90%.
Yeah, I'm skeptical of that.
I lived through that time, and I didn't see that myself. I could be wrong, but I was very curious.
No, I'd have to go check the tax brackets in that area. For the upper tax brackets, it probably was that high. There was a period of American history where it was 70, 80, 90% on the super rich.
Okay.
But his claim was that was for everybody, and there's no way.
Yeah.
No, that was just nonsense.
Thank you.
The gentleman kept pressing us that every time I tell you a fact, you refuse to acknowledge it, and I said because most of your facts are wrong. But, just because someone claims a fact, you don't submit in the argument of the point. You reserve the right to suspend judgment.
That's right.
So Nisbet made the point that in 1913 there was no contact with the federal government except the post office, and everything has been downhill since then. And the question always is, what happened to cause all this? And a lot of modern writers always point to that era, the Woodrow Wilson era, as the rise of elitism, the rise of leftism, the rise of progressivism, and that was what really gripped the federal government. And since then we've had these problems. We've had the Wilson War State, we had the FDR's New Deal, we had LBJ, the Great Society, all of these things that some of you lived through, and I didn't. I wasn't born until 74, which was what was the great crisis then, the oil crisis maybe. And they took our muscle cars away from us. So, but we've had all these problems. Everybody wants to point to some monumental event, and all the way up to Obamacare. This is the end of the nation. And it's not good, no doubt, but it's not. I don't think it's the end of the nation. But what I want to do is something that usually loses me friends, and that is to say that one of the problems, if not the major problem, was the passing of the Constitution. It's not that our Constitution is a bad Constitution as constitutions go, but that in American history, it was the time when you had a strong group of people trying to pass a law for a strong centralized government. And what you never hear about is the fierce opposition to that movement at the time from among the people and actually from a lot of the state politicians. There was a fierce battle. Now, how many of you have ever heard of the Federalist Papers? Everybody? Okay. How many of you have ever heard of the Anti-Federalist Papers? Fewer nods. Okay. What happened was during the ratification of the constitutional era of the Constitution, you had basically pamphlet wars in the newspapers, and each side would be writing, critiquing, and the Anti-Federalists were the ones who didn't want. The names are all wrong, by the way. The Federalists were not true Federalists. They wanted centralized government, and the Anti-Federalists who were opposing them were actually the true Federalists because they wanted to keep the levels of government intact. And they got into these pamphlet wars, and on the most well-known figure on the side of the Anti-Federalist who opposed the Constitution was Patrick Henry, the guy who started the revolution essentially with his "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. He was fiercely opposed to the passing of the Constitution because he wanted to retain local sovereignty. By the way, the Anti-Federalists were not opposed to revising the Articles of Confederation to take care of some problems it had. They just didn't want to take the full step into the centralization of the Constitution. And they had they had all kinds of beefs with it. Let me just read you a little bit of some of these comments from these pamphlets to see how they at the time viewed it. And they all wrote, just like the Federalist Papers wrote under the pseudonym of Publius. All of the Anti-Federalists wrote under pseudonyms too, so this one was called the Federal Farmer, and they believe it was Richard Henry Lee. He said, quote, "The plan of government now proposed, the Constitution, is evidently calculated totally to change, in time, our condition as a people. Instead of being 13 republics under a federal head, it is clearly designed to make us one consolidated government. This consolidation of the states has been the object of several men in this country for some time past. Whether such a change can be effected without convulsions and civil wars, whether such a change will not totally destroy the liberties of this country, time only can determine. Another one of them, writing under the name A Plebeian, summarized some of the misgivings they had with the proposed government. Number one, he said it is calculated to and will affect such consolidation of the states as to supplant and overturn the state governments. Number two, the representation in the general legislature is too small to secure liberty or to answer to the intention of representation. Remember the comment from Jefferson about liberty being bought and sold as at market? He's saying the same thing here. Number three, it gives to the legislature an unlimited power of taxation, direct and indirect. Okay? We'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. It is dangerous because the judicial power may extend to many cases which ought to be reserved to the decisions of state courts, and because the right of trial by jury is not secured in the judicial courts of the general government in civil cases. They actually later got that, though. He complained about the power to regulate elections, the power of the Senate, because it had a mixture of powers, legislative, judicial, and executive. He complained about the little degree of responsibility under which great officers of government will be held. And number 8, the liberty granted by the system to establish and maintain a standing army without any limitation or restriction. And so what Plebeian was summarizing, and this really is kind of a bare-bones summary of what most of them were arguing, was that the Constitution allowed them to go from where they were to a centralized government in which there was a centralized power over representation, over taxation, over the judicial power, and over the military power. And that all was surrendered by the states to the central government. Now, in my book, I've got several dozens of quotes from their works, and it was some of the best fascinating reading I've ever done in my researches to enter into some of the best minds and orators in American history and hear them debating with each other over these things and the passion and the things that were at stake. It was exhilarating for me. One of the writers wrote under the name of Brutus, and he complained of the taxation power under the Constitution, which was not there under the Articles. And here's what he had to say. Now, this is a little lengthy, but it's entertaining. He said, "This power, exercised without limitation, will introduce itself into every corner of the city and country, will wait upon ladies at their vanity, their domestic concerns, to the ball, the play, and to the assembly. It will go with them when they visit, and will, on all occasions, sit beside them in their carriages, nor will it desert them even at church. It will enter the house of every gentleman, watch over his cellar, wait upon his cook in the kitchen, follow the servants into the parlor, preside over the table, note down all that he eats or drinks. It will attend him to his bedchamber, and watch him while he sleeps. It will take cognizance of the professional man in his office or his study. It will watch the merchant in the counting house or in his store. It will follow the mechanic to his shop and in his work, and will haunt him and his family in his bed. It will be constant companion of the industrious farmer in all his labor. It will be with him in the house and in the field, observe the toil of his hands and the sweat of his brow. It will penetrate into the most obscure cottage, and finally, it will light upon the head of every person in the United States. To all these different classes of people, in all these circumstances in which it will attend them, the language in which it will address them will be, give, give. I say such a power must necessarily, from its very nature, swallow up all the power of the state governments." Okay, there was a man who had not only a serious beef on the taxation power, but can we not admit that it was extremely prescient? And basically what I do in this section of the chapter is show that point after point after point, the guys who were the critics of the Constitution were proven right over time. And then again, they didn't say this would happen overnight, but they were proven right over time. And so I don't want to take the time to go through all the rest of those points, but that was just on taxation. On the judiciary and on the military, these guys were all terrified of what was going to come, and everything they predicted would come has come until we're at the point we're at today. And in my estimation, it can't all be traced to the desire to have a strong centralized government. Now, we may have gone far beyond anything the Founding Fathers or even the most the ones who wanted centralized government the most ever dreamed of themselves. Were probably far beyond anything they could have conceived. But nevertheless, it did, in fact, set the ball in motion and create the conditions in which what we have today has come about. The highest one among them, by the way, who wanted centralized government was Alexander Hamilton. He actually envisioned the nation as a monarchy, but or at least essentially he wanted the president to rule for life. But there are other assaults on localism throughout history. One was the Electoral College. Originally, it was designed so that you had the votes made by district, and whatever a district voted for, either in a primary or a general election, that was counted as one vote. It was by 1824, 1832 that they switched it to a popular vote statewide, and winner took all. And so now you have the Electoral College system, basically, that we have today, in which whoever wins the popular vote in the state gets all the delegates for that state. I know it's different in caucus states, but North Carolina is not a caucus state, is it? No. Okay. But the problem with that is, when you have a state, for example, like Illinois, if you go there, the vast majority of the state are conservatives, Christian, pro-gun, anti-homosexuality, all our Christian values they hold. But the entire state is overrun by the votes that happen in Chicago because there's such a dense population there. And so the state as a whole always goes to a Democrat because as Chicago goes, the whole state goes. In the older system, all of all the votes for the other candidate would have gone to that candidate. In the new system, they all go as the population center goes. And, of course, you see the same problem in all the so-called blue states, just about. All the New England states, New York, California, Washington State. And it's a tension that happens throughout the country, in every state. I was just in Iowa a few weeks ago, and you had the same thing. The eastern part of the state and in the Des Moines area have a lot of liberal influence and power. But the vast majority of all the other counties in the state, they're all conservative Christians. But they can't get any political headway because of the way the system's rigged against them. So, again, they're all tied into a centralized system of government by political bands, and they're not allowed to assert their own local authority. And the second way we've had assaults on localism, I mentioned earlier, was the fact that the federal government buys off local governments through federal grants and programs. I've talked for about an hour now. Let me say that was how it was lost. Now, the question is, how do you get it back? And this is where everybody expects me to perform miracles. Keep in mind what we've said. This is something that is not going to happen overnight. We're in the very early stages. We're just beginning. We're just starting to win some seats, some political races in local and sometimes state government, and with people who are seriously dedicated to not taking the cheese, to cutting the budgets, to being firm on all these issues, to standing up for life and not giving lip service to it, to standing up for gun ownership and gun rights and not just giving lip service to it, and a whole list of other issues. So we're just at the beginning. This is the thin edge of the wedge. And my idea is to get a vision for this and to spread the vision and to start thinking about it. Because one thing I learned a long time ago is if you don't have a goal, you can't have a plan. And if you don't have a plan, you won't accomplish anything. You'll be spinning your wheels the whole time. You'll be going through your daily routine all the time, not accomplishing anything in the end. So my goal was to be just as radical as it needed to be, to say, here's what a biblical society looks like. That's my goal. Now let's talk about how we can get there. And obviously it's going to take tremendous sacrifice. People are going to have to give up things. And in some cases it will be financial sacrifice, and other times it will be sacrifices of time. In other cases it will be painstaking education and research. And in this case, I think there's a lot of education and research that needs to be done. But we have to shift our mentality. When we think politics all the time, we think immediately of Washington, D.C., and that's it. We vote every 4 years. We may go hold a sign in some parade or something, or put a sign in our yard, and that's the extent of our political activism. And that changes nothing. Rearranging the chairs in Washington, D.C. has proven to change nothing. Since 1964, when the Republican establishment threw Goldwater to the dogs, there has not been a single major accomplishment by conservatives at national political level, with the exception of a couple. They did cut the tax brackets a little bit. That's true. And if you wanted to account Reagan's victory at the Wall of Berlin and the fall of communism, that would be noteworthy. But aside from those two things, as far as reshaping the landscape in America to be a more conservative political nation, there's not been anything. We've accomplished nothing in those regards. So someone said something about the definition of insanity the other night, trying the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. And the problem is that all of that corruption that you deal with at that level, you also deal with at the local level of the state capitol, and you also deal with right in your backyard in your county commission. And if you start following what your county commission does regularly, you will watch millions of dollars be blown weekly, bi-weekly, monthly. And a lot of times it's going to contracts for cronies, money that doesn't need to be spent on stuff. A lot of times it's backed by teachers' unions. There's a whole list of ways it could be in corruption. So you have to, number one, get that goal and that vision and say, I'm going to make a plan and I'm going to attack this. And it may take 40 years of my life or my children's lives, but I'm going to plan for my grandchildren. And when it comes to education, get focused on local government. Because we got to find out what's going on. We got to find out where we're at and what our starting point is. So my advice is, especially to people who are homeschooling, is to do this with your children. Teach them, or you can do it yourself. That is, study your local government. I said this the other night in answer to a gentleman's question. Who are your local commissioners? Who are your city council members? Who are they? What's their background? Where do they go to church? What do they believe? What's their record? Start finding out how to get access to public information, because it's easy to do. By law, you're allowed to get any of it. You can pull up the agenda minutes to the meetings. You can pull up the reports of the minutes after the meetings. There's so much information out there that you can deal with. There's actually a website that's working on this, directing people to it. It's called the Sunshine Foundation, I believe. Or maybe Sunlight Foundation. I'll have to look it up again. But the point is, get access to the information. This is where the work and the research comes in. This is not a cakewalk. This is not voting once every 4 years. This is getting your hands involved and finding out what's going on. And it may not be for you to do. Maybe not. But maybe you know someone who can do it. It's like the gentleman was asking the other night. He says, all this stuff's going on in the government levels. And he said, but you got so many people, we work all day. and we're busy. We're constantly busy with family and all these other things, and I don't have time to do that. Well, not everybody's like that. In fact, most people go home and kick up their feet and watch TV for the rest of the night. But with your children especially, you can encourage them to get involved in these projects. And I would say children, I'm talking teenagers, high schoolers, and maybe young college age. Get involved in finding this information. And then once you get your hands on the information and you get an idea of what's going on, how things are working, you start a blog or a website that makes this stuff public.